This is the second of a series of webinars that Pew Charitable Trust and Resolve are putting on over kind of starting in July and going over the next 6 months or so related to the draft seabed mining regulations. We're very pleased to have quite a few folks already, and I'm anticipating we'll have quite a few more joining us over the next little bit. We're really excited today to have a fantastic panel of folks who really represent a great breadth of knowledge and insights that hopefully will help all of you kind of gain some understanding about the water column, the potential impacts of deep seabed mining on the water column, and how the deep seabed mining community can kind of factor those considerations into the work they need to do. I am going to pull up the agenda here as we go and just kind of go through that. Let's see, where is that? There it is. Just kind of walk through that briefly. And then I'm going to turn it over in just a minute for some opening comments from Andrew Friedman from Pew Charitable Trusts. But basically, as I already alluded to, the objective, as you see on your screen, is to hear from some scientific experts about the possible impacts of deep seabed mining on the water column, building on, or at least drawing from, the recent article that all three of the panelists were part of, that we also shared in advance of this webinar. We're also going to hear from a few other people about how emerging science and understanding of potential impacts of DSM will be addressed and considered in the regulation and control of deep seabed mining. In terms of the agenda, in a few minutes, as I said, we'll turn to Andrew for a few comments, and then we'll get into the scientific perspectives on those potential DSM impacts. I'll introduce all three of these scientists when we get to that point, but as you can see on the screen, we've got three folks. And then we'll turn to two other perspectives, one who's on the Legal and Technical Commission and another who is works for one of the contractors. For those of you that were on our July meeting, we were using a similar model and we got good feedback on that. And basically we've identified 3 questions that we'd like the panelists to discuss here, as you see on your screen, and we'll just turn to one of them for some opening comments. There's not a lot of time for that, so they won't get into a great in-depth, but we'll get some initial reactions from them. And then we'll get to questions from the participants, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. Before some closing remarks from myself and Andrew again, and then the webinar will adjourn at 19:30 in the East Coast, United States. Hopefully your calendar invitations have kind of adjusted to your time zone. So an hour and a half or so from now. So that's our agenda. A couple of things that I wanted to talk about logistics and in particular Zoom. So right now I think we have about, well, the last time I saw it, Zoom, we had about 75, 80 participants already. We had about 190 folks register. Some of those folks probably just registered, given all the time variations, to be able to make sure they got the recording, which we will be sending out afterwards, along with all of the slides that you see today. In terms of how Zoom's working, because we have so many people and just the nature of this opportunity, we've basically created a situation where you all are listening and watching the presenters and the slides and me right now as we go, but you will not be able to actively kind of verbally participate in the conversation. However, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you're welcome to put in questions there that you can send to the presenters. We'll behind the scenes be kind of looking at those and trying to package them together so we can address as many of them as possible in that Q&A session. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of them. The presenters will be able to see them. They might be able to respond to them in the moment, but we've encouraged them just to kind of focus on, given that they have relatively short amount of time, to focus on their prepared remarks. So they may not be able to get to your direct questions. If you have any questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A tool to raise, by questions, I mean concerns, things aren't working, something like that. You're welcome to put something in the Q&A tool, or you can send an email to either Maya Breitberg-Smith or Laura Bartok of Resolve. There's a chat function in there. I think that's been turned off for you all. We may use it to share some information throughout, but it's probably unlikely in this particular one since we've already shared the link to the paper. In terms of the participants, we can't show, Zoom doesn't allow us to show a list of the participants, but in the summary, which we're also going to be developing and sending out afterwards, we will include a list of all the individuals and their affiliations that did participate. So you'll be able to see the breadth and the depth of folks who participated. And I think that does it for my opening comments. So I'm gonna do the stop share here, and I'm gonna ask Andrew to bring his video online and share a few opening comments as well. Andrew, thanks.
Thank you, Paul, and I'll be very brief as I know we have a lot to cover, and it's our panelists that people have tuned in to hear from. But first, let me just say thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, for those who attended the first webinar, and welcome, especially for those joining us for the first time. As Paul mentioned, this is the second in a series we're organizing with our friends at Resolve. And the fact that we have recorded nearly double the attendance for this session compared to the last is, I think, a reflection of the importance not just of this issue specifically, but of the discussion about the impacts of seabed mining more generally. And it shows an eagerness to continue it, even while some of the usual formats for it are impossible. And in that vein, I hope all of you and those you care about are safe and healthy as we continue to muddle forward through this, unfortunately, still unfolding crisis. I said a few words about Pew in the last webinar, but for newcomers, we are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to the principle that better public information leads to better public policy outcomes. International conservation and ocean conservation specifically is a cornerstone of our work, and in that context, for more than 5 years, we've been engaged at the International Seabed Authority, pushing to meet our collective mandate under Article 145 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to ensure that mining of areas beyond national jurisdiction does not go forward without first ensuring the effective protection of the marine environment from potential harmful effects. And up to this point, much of the discussion around those effects has focused on the ocean bottom and the unique, vulnerable, and still largely mysterious living marine communities that populate it. Far less examined, but certainly no less important, are the potential effects of mining in the water column. And that's changing, and it's in thanks in no small part to an effort that includes the scientists joining our panel today. Through a series of research projects and articles, including a recent opinion piece published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science here in the US, and a corresponding article in the New York Times. These scientists are shedding light on a critical suite of considerations related to the water column. And Paul will make more formal introductions, but to Drs. Drazen, Grient, and Haddock, let me just say we're tremendously pleased you could join us, and I'm sure everyone participating is eager to hear more about your work and your findings. But in discussing the scope of this session with our friends at Resolve, we decided it would help to go a bit further, if we could, and consider not just the potential impacts of mining in the water column, but what those impacts might mean for the decisions we make about mining, and indeed how all emerging science is taken into account by regulators evaluating plans for work and contractors drafting them. And in that regard, we're honored to also have Michelle Walker, chair of the ISA's Legal and Technical Commission, with us to offer some reflections, as well as Dr. Tomohiko Fukushima of the Deep Ocean Development Corporation. I don't want to stand in the way of hearing what I know are going to be some fascinating remarks. I would just like to, again, thank our partners at Resolve for organizing this discussion today, And of course, again, thank all of you for making the time to join us. And with that, I will turn it back over to Paul to take us into our speakers.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we are, let's just jump into it. Two quick reminders. One, we aren't going to be able to necessarily address the questions that you might have real time. However, go ahead and put them in the Q&A as they come up. Again, the presenters might be able to look at those, but if not, we'll try and fold those into that discussion session at the end. And we'll try and get as many of those answered as possible. So we're going to hear from three scientists. The first up is Dr. Drazen. Jeff's a professor at the Department of Oceanography at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. His research interests are the trophic ecology and energetics of the open ocean and deep sea, particularly fishes. He's participated in several research expeditions to the CCZ to evaluate benthic communities before deep sea mining occurs. And he's leading projects to evaluate the potential effects of mining on midwater ecosystems. So thank you very much for being here, Dr. Drazen, and go ahead, feel free to put on up your slides.
Thanks very much, Paul. Okay. All right, everyone can see this okay? Paul, does that look good?
Yep, looks great.
Okay.
You're on the right and the slides are on the left, and it looks a beautiful picture.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Pew and Resolve for inviting me to speak today and for putting on this webinar. As mentioned, I'm talking about some work that a number of us started as a workshop in late 2018, basically a team of Midwater scientists coming together to evaluate what the potential environmental risks were from deep sea mining to the midwaters, to the pelagic. You can see some of the wondrous diversity of life in that water column on this slide here and in the background behind me. I think most people in this audience are well acquainted with deep sea mining, so I won't spend much time here, but this just shows the three main mineral deposit types: hydrothermal vents, seamounts, and abyssal plains. And these are different habitats, and there may be different industry developments, engineering components to mining these different resources. And so the effects at each of those could be different. And that's just important to keep in mind, to have that context as we talk about some of these potential mining effects. There's seamounts and vents are going to be mined at much shallower depths and may require active grinding of resources, whereas on the abyssal plains, it's much deeper and the nodules are being lifted out of mud. So there's no actual cutting of ore in that case, for instance. So management and science has really taken a benthic focus up until just recently. The International Seabed Authority has a mandate to protect the marine environment from potential harmful effects of deep sea mining. And this is very important because those countries that are signatories to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea also have a clause in there that says that they will ensure equal or better protection in their own territorial waters compared to what they've signed on to and agreed to on the high seas with the ISA. So the ISA process is really quite important, probably globally, in terms of managing deep sea mining. And it is probably a little up in the air right now because of COVID, but I believe the ISA's goal is to approve exploitation regulations in 2021. So there's a bit of urgency to gathering knowledge and understanding the ecosystems and the potential for environmental risk. So up to now, there's been a very understandable focus on the seafloor. That's where the direct effects of mining are going to occur. And this is a focus that has been both in the science and in the policy realms. I think most people have just focused on those important ecosystems. And so that caused a number of us to think about the water column. And what about the pelagic? What kinds of potential effects might there be? And it's important to keep in mind that this ecosystem is really critical. The deep midwaters, which we're defining here as depths from 200 meters to just above the seafloor. This is an enormous suite of ecosystems that span about 90% of the livable volume on our planet. They contain a fish biomass. It's about 100 times greater than the global annual fish catch. And they're critical in connecting the surface waters to these deeper ecosystems, including the seafloor that's been the focus of much previous study. The mid-water column plays key roles in carbon export, getting carbon out of the shallow ocean atmosphere coupling, and also in regenerating nutrients that fuels primary production in the oceans. The deep midwaters also provide prey resources to commercially harvested species of fish, like some deep diving tunas, bluefin and big eye, for instance. And as you saw from the title slide, the deep midwaters contain a very unique and wondrous biodiversity. So what might these kinds of impacts be? This is a schematic from the paper that we published just a month or two ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it illustrates, it's a diagram, a schematic, if you will, of the potential effects in the ecosystems. So we have a surface ship, and it's connected via a riser pipe or some sort of lifting device to a seafloor collector vehicle. Now in the front of this diagram, we have the abyssal plains at much greater depths, and then illustrated to the left is a mid-ocean ridge in the middle of which you might mine for massive sulfides, and on the right, you've got a seamount system. And in the actual mining collectors may differ between these places, but they're all going to be connected to some sort of surface ship for the lifting of materials. The mining devices on the seafloor will collect a plume or create a plume of sediment that will affect the water column just above the seafloor, the collector plume. And once this ore is lifted to the surface, if we just focus for a moment on the nodules, there's going to be a lot of sediment and seawater lifted. Oh, and I apologize, but I forgot to say, in the abyssal nodule case, we think that a single license area contractor may mine between about 300 and 600 square kilometers per year for a claim. So that gives you sort of a direct scale of this. And then these are the indirect water column impacts that I was just talking about, the sediment plumes, the collector plume, and then this dewatering plume, because when this mud and ore is lifted to the surface ship, it's then separated, and the unwanted mud and seawater is discharged back into the ocean in what's called a dewatering plume. And it's estimated that that will be something on the order of 50,000 cubic meters of muddy seawater per day. To keep this in context, a 20-foot shipping container is about 50 cubic meters in volume. So in addition to this plume of mud, there will be dissolved chemicals. There will be metals that have dissolved from the breaking of the ore. And so there will be a dissolved or chemical plume, and that won't settle. And so that may have a much greater spatial and temporal extent than the dewatering plumes. In addition to these plumes, it's going to be noisy. There's going to be noise created at the seafloor and in these riser systems, bringing the ore up to the surface ship. What is the scale of these effects? And the short answer is we don't know. This hasn't happened yet. We do have some models. Most of the models of sediment plumes are from collector plumes near the seafloor. They vary pretty greatly in what they predict is the extent of these plumes, but it seems that they're on the order of 10 to 100 kilometers from the site. There are some plume models that are being actively pursued for dewatering plumes. There are just a couple of publications on this as well. And so hopefully we'll have some more answers from a modeling perspective soon. So what are the effects that could potentially occur to these communities? So noise obviously will affect marine mammals, but potentially other fauna as well that are sensitive to noise. Muddy seawater will cause respiratory distress due to clogged gills and respiratory surfaces. These animals, on the top is a suspension feeding copepod, and on the bottom is a video of a gelatinous zooplankton called a larvation. It creates this marvelous mucus web, and it pumps its tail there, filtering particles through that web. These animals may have their filtering apparatus clogged, or they may have to sift through a lot of mud particles to get to the organic particles that they're actually after. So these animals, which are the base of midwater food webs, could be particularly susceptible. There may be buoyancy issues for gelatinous organisms that have very finely tuned buoyancy and now have sediment settling on their bodies. And this figure here is just sort of illustrating that toxicity is certainly a potential risk, and it's very complicated to predict. This figure here is a model, or is results from a benthic organism, and copper toxicity on the left and cadmium toxicity on the right. But it's a benthic organism, and you can see that there are different temperature and pressure combinations for each of these toxicities, and they make a difference. So we can't take simply a shallow water organism, understand how copper might affect its biology, and extrapolate that to the deep ocean under different temperatures and pressures. In addition, there may be reduction in visual communication. This is a marvelous barrel eye fish. It has these wondrous eyes underneath a transparent dome for a forehead. It illustrates just how important vision can be. This video here shows a dragonfish. You're looking at it from underneath, and you're seeing all of the lights on its belly, lights under its eyes to the left, and lights extending out onto its fins. Many organisms, and I'm sure Steve will talk about this more, but many organisms in the deep water column use bioluminescence to communicate with. Given this importance of visual communication in this environment, muddy water may reduce reproductive potential and prey capture potential for a lot of the organisms. So those are some of the potential effects. In this diagram here on the left, the schematic, we can see those individual effects will integrate to population levels, depending upon the scale of the perturbations. And that may result in changes in community composition in the midwaters. It may simply cause animals to emigrate from the area, particularly if they're more mobile. Many animals, particularly those that are not mobile, may simply die. There's mortality. And finally, a number of them may experience decreased fitness or reproductive output. These type of population level consequences could have ramifications for ecosystem services. We look on the diagram here to the right. One of the services that may be affected is fisheries. And we have a host of pelagic species, and they dive to depth to feed. In addition, a host of midwater animals undergo a vertical migration every day. Zooplankton, micronecton, they are living during the day at depth, and they migrate towards the surface at night. And so food webs in the water column are very mixed. That may mean that chemicals that enter the midwaters could actually be translated through this food web into our seafood supply. Here's a figure by a paper by Nella Choi, and it just shows a number of Pacific fishes that we harvest and eat, and their mercury concentration on the vertical axis versus their depth that they typically occur on the x-axis, which comes from tagging data. And you can see that these deep divers actually have much higher mercury concentration. This is just a natural example of how a metal, mercury, naturally enters midwater food webs. If we inject other metals into this system, it's possible that we could also have similar effects. Whoops, I went too far. I also wanted to indicate that for ecosystem services, this migration on a daily, on a daily basis of animals moves a lot of carbon out of the surface ocean and into the deep sea, and that could be affected. And then, of course, we may experience losses in biodiversity. So what do we do about this? What are some steps forward? Well, right now, the ISA, government agencies, stakeholders are all sort of intertwined in regulation. Certainly, I would argue ISA is leading the charge. And I would say that we need to mandate, rather than just recommend, the midwater ecosystem baselines occur. And we've actually had a lot of movement in this area. The ISA released a revision to their guidelines and recommendations, which included a lot more detail on the water column, which was very welcome. And a couple of contractors are actively engaged in generating comprehensive midwater baselines right now. So things have changed just in the last year or so. I think that the midwaters require that scientists and managers also take a drifting perspective. The water column is not fixed in place. And we have no mining zones in a number of the high seas mining areas. We have preservation reference zones. One license area can be located abutting another. And the effects in one area could very well be translocated into a neighboring area or into a no mining zone, et cetera. So we need to think that, you know, the effects are going to be flowing through this system rather than fixed in place. We need the creation of suitable standards and thresholds for effects. We have at this point in time no data, no empirical studies on how sediment concentrations will affect midwater organisms in the open ocean. So let alone metals or other potential contaminants. Large-scale mining tests are going to happen. Companies will put forward components of their collecting systems. There have been efforts in Japan where they have tested mining apparatus on hydrothermal vents and just recently, I believe this year, on seamounts. And I think it's very important that we empirically follow these tests and study what happens in the water column. And finally, everybody who was a co-author on this paper and just about everybody in this workshop felt very strongly that it should be mandated that the dewatering plume be placed well below the mesopelagic, so below about 1,500 to 2,000 meters. And in the case of nodule mining, all the way back to the seafloor. So that may vary because in vent mining, some of the water column just above those vents is critical for larval transport. So it may differ between resource type. But right now, there's no regulations about where in the water column mud will be discharged. And then the last potential step forward that I'll put forth to you is that minimization of sound in the noise in the sound fixing and ranging channel is important. So this SOFAR channel is located at about 500 to 1,500 meters. It's a place where sound actually propagates for very long distances horizontally in the ocean due to just the properties, the thermal properties and changes through the water column. And so minimizing sound there will really minimize the scale of noise effects. And with that, I just really want to acknowledge all of the co-authors on the PNAS paper, and there are also more people who were participants at the workshop that we held in 2018. Thank you all for your contributions and thoughts. I'd like to thank the folks at University of Hawaii for supporting this endeavor, the Schmidt Ocean Institute and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for funding the workshop and contributions, and of course to Pew and Resolve for organizing this webinar. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff. Much appreciated. So we're going to move on to, and again, remember, if you have questions that you'd like the panel to consider, definitely feel free to do that. Next up is Dr. Vandergrint. And so Jesse, you can bring up your screen. There you go, thanks, and your slides. So Jessie earned her PhD in zoology from the University of Oxford. There she focused on deep sea macroecological patterns and macrofaunal body size and diversity. So many of you will know what that means. Maybe not all of you though. We'll hear a little more maybe. As well as deep sea trawling impacts in the Northwest Atlantic. After that, she was a postdoc at the School of Geography at the University of Oxford, where she worked on modeling the effects of multiple simultaneous stressors in the California current and in the Arctic shallow waters. And now she's back to focusing on deep ecosystems again, or deeper ecosystems. She works as a postdoc on the potential impacts of DSM on midwater community in Jeff's lab. So Jessie, thank you for joining us today. And I'll turn it over to you. You've got about 7 or so minutes. Thanks, Jessie.
Sure. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you to the Pew and Resolve team for having me today to talk about the spatial intersection between high seas fisheries and deep sea mining, which are basically showing off the results of a study that Jeff and I and a co-author have conducted. Briefly, diurnal vertical migrators like these form an important food source for many species, including billfish and tuna, which some of us might really enjoy to eat. That means that when I enjoy my poke bowl here in Hawaii, I have a connection to the deep sea. As Jeff already said, several species of tuna and billfish, like swordfish and big-eyed tuna, are deep divers and can occur at deeper depths themselves. Mesopelagic species could be impacted by the dewatering plume if it causes, for example, but not limited to, respiratory distress, reduced feeding, reduced visual communication, and toxicity effects. This could reduce their biomass if it increases mortality and or decreases reproductive and fitness success. For food web connections, as well as direct impacts on the fisheries target species that occur at these depths, that can have consequences for what's on our dinner plate. So it's worth thinking about the intersection of these two industries. Here I've highlighted the 30 areas for which the ISA has already released exploration licenses. They fall into 6 areas that are color-coded based on the main deposit types currently being targeted for deep sea mining. As you can see, they all fall in larger areas that are managed by regional fisheries management organizations that I've highlighted here with the brown borders and abbreviated names. And we decided to measure the intersection between the two industries as a comparison of the catch that is obtained in and around the mining areas to the catch of the RFMO that they're located in. This percentage can then serve as a proxy of intersection between the two industries. We looked at 3 different tunas, the skipjack, the big eye, and the yellowfin tuna, because we found that these were often the most dominant species caught in these mining areas. We compiled 2 different data sets to take advantages of different sources, but they differed in the reported fisheries catches because of differences in the spatial resolution of the catches and what and who was reporting. And we investigated intersection over space, but more on that later. Here I'm showing you a location-specific analysis or result. You see that there are ranges reported, and these ranges are based on the differences between the tunas, the spatial analyses, and the 2 data sets. And you can see that most of the mining areas have low levels of intersection with the RFMO that they're located in. The Clarendon-Clipperton zone, located in the ARTTC, is the exception and shows up to moderate levels of intersection. When we investigate the effect of distance away from the mining areas, we see that the spread of the dewatering plume can potentially be very important. In any mining area, we saw that the intersection increased with the distance away from the mining areas. As we currently don't know how the dewatering plumes are going to spread at these different locations, we use these equidistances away from the mining areas. These distances or zones were chosen for different reasons. So our smallest zone, the 50-kilometer one, is chosen because highly migratory species that occur in these areas can easily swim these distances in a day. The 100-kilometer zone is chosen because it's the same size as the size of the buffer zones around areas of particular environmental interest, which are no mining zones, and they have already been established for the Clarendon-Clipperton zone, and they are proposed for the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The 200-kilometer zone was our extreme case. So as I said, in any mining area, intersection increases with the distance away from the mining area, but we still see those location-specific effects. And at any zone size, the Clarendon-Clipperton zone showed the highest levels of intersection. We explored intersection further by looking at a country-specific level, and you can immediately see that these numbers are not the same. So intersection is not equal for these countries. These countries that I highlight here were in the top 5 based on the average annual catch in the 50-kilometer zone of these mining areas. So the big players, if you will. And they show us different stories. So here in this polymetallic sulfide area and in the prime crust zone, we see these countries have low levels of intersection, just like the location-specific analysis showed. But if we look at this polymetallic nodule area here, and for example, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, we see examples that go up to moderate levels of intersection. We even see examples, so for example, here in Mexico and in the Philippines, of values that go over 20%, so moderate to high levels. So even with these big players, they show different levels of intersection, highlighting that we need to have this country-specific outlook when we explore the conflict between the 2 industries. And while these are the big players, they're not necessarily representative of everyone else. We explored the data set further to look for cases where there were any moderate to high cases as well. And what we found for the moderate to high cases, irrespective of how much they were fishing, we found a lot of small island nations and developing nations. And not only that, we saw in some cases that there was not variation in the data. This lack of variation was based because there was no effect of distance on this intersection. I will say that for some of these countries, like Belize, are known for their practices of providing flags of convenience. So that would alter the true nature of the intersection for this country. But by now I've showed you many examples of countries that have moderate to high levels of intersection. And in some cases, it's possible that developing nations might see a disproportionate effect, even though they are not the large fishing nations. We need high seas fisheries to become aware of this. They're currently not really aware of this potential intersection in space between two industries, even though it could potentially affect the fisheries catches. If they become active, we need them to become active stakeholders in the development of the mining regulations. The mining companies will have to adhere to these regulations, and they're currently being developed and put in place by the ISA, as Jeff already said. The mining regulations, also called the mining code, include something that's called the environmental impact assessment. This is important in the planning and management process because it's used to anticipate, assess, and reduce the risk to the environment and society. Stakeholders have the opportunity to raise concerns about potential conflict during this environmental impact assessment. So this is the time where high seas fisheries should also raise potential concerns about conflicts between these two industries. The contributions of high seas fisheries as another stakeholder in the blue economy are vital. With that, I would like to take a moment to thank my co-authors in this project, Phoebe Woodward, Jeff Coates, and Jeffrey Drazen. I also like to acknowledge and thank my funding source, the Benioff Ocean Initiative. And I would like to thank the Pew and Resolve team for organizing and hosting this webinar.
Okay, Jesse, thanks so much. Very much appreciated. Looks like you're enjoying Hawaii there, so that's great. Okay, finally on the science side of the presentations, we have Dr. Haddock. Steve is a senior scientist at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute in California, and also adjunct faculty at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He uses molecular and genetic methods along with submersibles to study deep sea biodiversity and biooptics. Specializing in the gelatinous inhabitants of the water column. He's discovered numerous species, including a 6-foot-long jelly that uses glowing lures to attract fish, and the green bomber, quote unquote, worm, featured in the Octonauts TV show, which I will have to look up. So Steve, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the discoveries that we've made in the water column that end up being relevant to, I think, this question of effects of mining on the midwater. And first, as Jeff pointed out, a lot of the focus on when you talk about the deep sea is on the deep sea floor. So here's this textbook, one of the big books in our field, Deep Sea Biology, but really it's about the deep sea floor. And if you look at the chapter contents, they're all talking about the benthos, and it doesn't really address what's happening in the water column. This is pretty unfortunate because if you think about the volume of space on the Earth, again, as has been mentioned by Jeff, you know, we think of the skin of the ocean as being 2/3 of the planet, or maybe the bottom of the ocean being 2/3 of the area. But we have this huge water column in between where all kinds of organisms are living and interacting. So when we talk about mining, there's sediment plumes that are generated by the mining machinery locally, and this could be especially important on vents and with the seamounts when that's going directly into the water column. But in the nodule fields, that's brought to the surface, and then the mud is returned back to the ocean in this sediment plume. I think a lot of focus is, or, you know, if we think of these effects, we can divide them up into where the plume lands on the seafloor is going to have an effect. The plume that settles through the water column is going to have an effect. But importantly, I think for this discussion, there's a portion of that plume that is going to drift through the water. And this is, in oceanographic contents, we talk about dissolved organic matter versus particulate organic matter. This would be the dissolved fine sediments and chemicals that will not sink to the seafloor and will just settle through the plume. If we think about that settling portion of of the plume, clearly the height that you deposit it at is going to have a huge impact and make differences in how it affects the communities on the sea floor. So the area is, if it's a cone that's falling down, the area is going to be proportional to the height squared. So as you get it closer to the sea floor, the affected area gets much smaller, but of course the concentration is doing the opposite at the same time. So you're going to have more concentrated material reaching a smaller area. So while the same amount may end up on the sea floor, this may argue that you want it to be high up in the water column to minimize the effects on the benthos, because they're going to get less of a load. They're not going to be directly smothered. However, it passes through a much, much different volume of water if you raise it up. The volume, if it's a cone, is proportional to the cube of the height. So in this example, if it's at 3,000 meters above the seafloor, which is definitely feasible in some of the proposals, it passes through 1.3 billion cubic meters versus if it's 100 meters off, it passes through 1,500 meters. So it's 880,000 times more water is going to be affected just by that sinking portion of the plume. Then the other component is this drifting portion. And this is the part that we have, I think, the least handle on. But we know, as Jeff mentioned, that there's going to be large volumes of material that are released every day. I estimated that this would be a fleet of tanker trucks. So like imagine those, petrol trucks driving along the freeways, 15 miles long, bumper to bumper. That's every day the volume of sediment that's being returned to the ocean. And so I think this highlights some of our biggest knowledge gaps, is that how far is that plume going to go? Even if the plume distributes very slowly, it's going to go a long distance because of the time are continuous for 20 or 30 years. This is just an example of a map from the Cook Islands showing they have these 50-mile buffer zones set up around each island. But if they do a mining operation in between those buffer zones, it could still impinge on their waters and their reefs where they're relying on it for fisheries. So one of the predominant features of the organisms that live in this deep water column is that a lot of them are bioluminescent. So if you look here, this is bioluminescent and non-bioluminescent organisms from the surface to about 4,000 meters. And we found that 3/4 of the animals that we could see with the with our ROV camera, so 3/4 of the relatively large animals, are bioluminescent. And this water, when you get into the deep water, most of the light is in this blue region, and whereas in the surface, it's sort of more blue-green. And that's also the wavelength that bioluminescence operates at. If you look at the transparency of the water, you get really good transmission in the deep ocean for these blue wavelengths. As soon as you start adding sediment, it sucks that light out of the water, and it can't transmit nearly as far. So that you're peering through this muddy haze instead of being able to communicate over distances that it's estimated for, that they can communicate over distances of 100 meters. So bioluminescence is used in many, many ways, and a lot of organisms will use it in multiple ways, actually, for camouflage and communication and for prey attraction. This is just some examples of the ways that organisms use bioluminescence. So affecting that channel of communication for them is going to have a big impact on their lives. This is just one example of a siphonophore that we worked on. We looked at 5 different species, and they're distinguished by the shape of these stinging cells on their tentacles. And 3 of those species are predominantly below 1,500 meters. 2 of them were only found below 1,500 meters. On their tentacles, they use bioluminescent lures to attract fish in that environment where fish aren't just swimming around, easy to come by. Another thing that we've looked at with Anela Choi is what is the food web in that environment? Your classical view of it is this squid, fish, shrimp, kind of the hard-bodied organisms. But when we look with the ROV, we see a much more involved picture. And each one of these threads is essentially a story of who eats whom. in the deep ocean. So this highlights the connectivity that is going on down there. And as Jesse mentioned, it reaches all the way to our bowl of poke that we're enjoying. One example that I like to highlight is this comb jelly that seems to specialize on eating this polychaete worm. And this worm is an organism that eats marine snow. So it's eating that sediment that's falling through the water. And we found that many organisms rely on marine snow instead of what's called primary productivity, instead of the production of, well, at least indirectly on primary productivity. So this is a breakdown. These are bioluminescent and non-bioluminescent organisms through the water column. But if you look at the groups that are particle feeders, filter feeding groups, you can see that it's a large component, and increasingly so in the deep sea. A large portion of these things are relying on filter feeding and particle feeding to survive. So if you sum it all up, there's just a huge diversity of potential effects of especially this advected plume, but also the sinking plume that could result from deep sea mining operations. And I wanted to thank Jeff for organizing that workshop that got me really thinking about that, and Nella for writing an article with me about this. And then also discussions with Jackie Evans and with Diva have influenced my, my thinking on this greatly.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Lots to think about from all three of you. Much appreciated. We are running a little off the agenda, but obviously, I think folks were pretty interested to hear from all of you about these potential impacts. So thank you very much. We are going to transition now to some slightly different perspectives on how to address and consider emerging science. We're very pleased to have Michelle Walker with us to offer some first thoughts. For those of you that don't know her from all her work with the ISA at the annual meeting and also on the LTC, Michelle's an attorney with over 25 years of experience in international law, including law of the sea. She works for the Attorney General's Chambers of Jamaica. And she's also the chair of the ISA's Legal and Technical Commission. So Michelle, if you want to share your screen, or not your screen, but your video, that would be great. And welcome, and look forward to hearing your thoughts. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And also thanks to Pew and Resolve for this opportunity to speak at this webinar. I have a very short time to give a perspective from the ISA's point of view on the regulatory framework that we have in place to deal with some of the issues relating to the assessing the impacts of the deep seabed mining in the water column. But here we go. So starting at the beginning, my first slide. Can we start looking at it quickly? Right. Recommendations. Part of the mandate that the LTC has is to issue recommendations for the guidance of contractors, be technical or administrative matters, basically to assist contractors in implementing the regulations. One of the critical ones here is a recommendation for the guidance of contractors for the assessment of the possible environmental impacts arising from the exploration of minerals in the area. These are revised recommendations dated March 30th of this year under the exploration regulations. And these, as we can see here, have substantive references dealing with the water column. As you can see, Annex 1 of the document indicates areas of focus. And with my legal training, I am not going to attempt to pronounce most of these, but you can see the areas of focus that have been covered here. And this is a distinct improvement over the previous document, which had mainly a benthic focus. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see that the point is the recommendation in developing these recommendations, it was done after consultation with experts in a range of areas, a large number of scientists, managers, and other specialists. This was both in keeping with a mandate under the convention, and it also was a way to take into account the emerging science. The issue of timing, the fact that they were issued this year in March 2020 means that for the Commission, the first opportunity to see how effectively the more is being done with the new extensive recommendations will only be in July 2021, when we receive the annual reports for contractors for that year, because of the fact that the annual reports are due in March of each calendar year. So March next year, they will submit the reports and the Commission will look at them in July 2021. But that doesn't mean that the information has not, on the water column aspects, were not available for contractors to consider before. In fact, in many ways they were, as we can see from the fact that there were previous workshops done by the ISA on various areas. So there was a workshop on polymetallic nodules in 1999, one on SMS in 2006, and on cross in same 2006. And each of those, in each case, there were reports that were produced, and these reports were made publicly available. So the contractors have had an extended period of time to have this information available for them to consider. So all that has happened now is the recommendations have been consolidated and they have now been mandated to look at it. So the question of data being made available and presented to us is a new mandate, but the responsibility to provide it, or the opportunity to consider how the information should be provided is not so new, basically. So if we look at the issues on the next slide, another way that the issue of the existing science is taken into account is under the 5-year periodic review of the implementation of the plan of work, which is an exercise conducted jointly between the Secretary General and the contractor. However, in that process, the LTC is also asked to provide comments to the Secretary General, and among the areas that are considered are the water column studies done by the contractor. So these are looked at by the Commission and they are reviewed as part of that process. At the end of each periodic review, the comments that are provided to the contractor by the Secretary General are then provided as guidance to the contractor for it to make a determination for the next plan of work for the next 5-year cycle. So there is guidance to the contractor as to how to proceed, including the information about those water column studies. Similarly, the review of the annual reports by the contractors on their plan of work, they're now being 30, includes water column studies. And there is regular feedback from the LTC to the contractors on the development and adequacy of the sampling programs. And this is a two-way process. So the LTC provides feedback to the contractors, and in the following year, we seek a response from the contractor as to what they did with the feedback. they were given. Did they respond? What kind of response did they provide? And that is specifically looked at for each contract. So if we can move on to the next slide. And so that is for the exploration contracts. Moving on to the exploitation, which we have been discussing. The commission, with the aid of a consultant, did the initial drafting of the exploitation regulations, and they are now being negotiated in the council. They are not going to be, they're not on the council agenda for this year. So the next time the council will substantively consider them is in March 2021, more than likely. And there is still a significant amount of work to be done. So at that February-March 2021 session, the council will make a determination as to how it will proceed, because there is substantive work on the regulations themselves, and there are a host of standards and guidelines that are being developed, which are critical for the implementation of the regulations themselves. So the council at that point will decide, including the deadlines it has set for itself, how it will proceed. Part 4 deals with the protection and preservation of the marine environment, and that understandably attracted a great deal of discussion, debate, and amendment. Okay, and one of the areas there was the environmental impact statement, and included in that is a template, and what that template specifically looks at the water column characteristics, including areas such as the specification of impact and management measures to mitigate those impacts. So the draft exploitation regulations, as they are now, do address some of those issues, including that specific provision. In addition to which, the commission, while the regulations themselves are before the council, the commission has been mandated to develop standards and guidelines for the operation of the regulations, the standards and guidelines being similar but different from the recommendations under the exploration regulations. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see one set of those regulations, one set of those guidelines, I'm sorry. One particular set are the guidelines for the environmental impact assessment and the environmental impact statement. And these guidelines are being developed through a technical working group. And that technical working group has been convened under the commission, and it's being chaired by someone I think most of you know quite well, Malcolm Clark. And the TWG is now working as time and resources allow. It's actually working intercessionally. And some of the issues it is looking at are the water column environment, and as well as specification of impacts and management measures to mitigate some of those impacts. And so some of those issues will be included in the guidelines. Yes, so if we go on to the next slide. All right. Generally, some of the issues that have been raised by the previous speakers can be dealt with, or may most appropriately be dealt with through the development of standards or guidelines, or standards and guidelines. For example, to mitigate the impact of dewatering discharge. Just something to bear in mind, and to note very importantly that several of the issues that were identified here can be done under the standards and guidelines, which are still being developed. The regulations and the standards and guidelines are an ongoing process. They are far from being concluded. So some of the issues that have been raised here are are work in progress. A lot of them are work in progress. The environmental issues are still under consideration. So none of these issues have been settled by any means. And as has been pointed out, these documents are not static, rather they are flexible and do respond to changes in knowledge and as well as developments in best industry practice, best environmental practice, best available scientific information. That they are there to meet the changes. We recognize that things are evolving constantly. The state of knowledge is evolving constantly, and they are designed to deal with that. So we're trying to do best we can. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for providing folks with that kind of overarching kind of view of how the ISA, LTC are involved and how folks could move forward. Our last presenter is Dr. Tomo Fukushima with Deep Ocean Resources Development. And so Tomo, you can turn on your camera at this point. Dr. Fukushima began working with DORD in April. He previously received a master's in fisheries science from Tokyo University of Fisheries, and then a doctoral degree from Kyoto University. His doctoral thesis is titled Ecological Characteristics of Deep Sea Benthic Organisms in Relation to Manganese Nodules Development Practices. So quite appropriate for this webinar. Before moving to DORD, he worked with the Ocean Policy Research Foundation, the University of Tokyo as an associate professor, and most recently, the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, or JAMSTEC. So Tomo, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you. We've got, and just keep it in about your original time would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, Pew and Resro. I'm working for DORD. I am attending this workshop as one of the contractors who signed an exploration contract with International Seabed Authority, ISA. From now on, I will talk about relationship between emerging science and contractors as my personal opinion. Next slide, please. My specialty field is benthic ecology. However, in 1990s, I have involved a water current survey to obtain basic information to consider the way of discharge of mining wastewater. In that time, I applied CTD observation, white plankton, zooplankton sampling, culture experiment, current velocity direction observation using a mooring system. However, with the passage of time, new equipment was developed and the accuracy of observation became higher. And our survey, which is conducted 30 years ago, has become obsolete. It is a contractor's duty to keep up with emerging science and then provide new information to stakeholder. However, science is rapidly advancing. It is not easy to keep up with. So how should contractors interact with emerging science? In order to consider this question, I think it is necessary to know the essential of science. Next slide, please. So, what is a science? Science was progressing. Science is progressing. Science will be progressing. Because the motivation of scientists to discover new fact. New fact can be understood as fact that cannot be measured by conventional standard. The state in which new fact appears one after the another can be said divergence. If we compare it to mountain climbing, there are various routes to reach the summit, and those are as if long and winding road. And then sometimes it is necessary to go back. Like this, scientific knowledge is repeatedly revised. Next slide, please. There are procedures in science. At first, scientist is interested in a certain natural phenomenon, and then they obtain data by those observation experiment. And if those data are compiled, it will be information. When the information will be linked with each other, it will be generalized. And then hypothesis to explain natural phenomenon will born. That is the first step in science procedure. Another word, inductive approach in first step. Next slide, please. The second step in scientific procedure is hypothesis verification. In order to verify a hypothesis, scientists must disprove counter-argument that denies the hypothesis. A hypothesis that disproves a number of counter-arguments is a robust hypothesis. It is not a verification just to find the fact that supports the hypothesis, which is called justification. This is because the intentional way is inevitable. Next slide, please. So characteristic of science is summarized as follows. Science seeks new discovery. Scientists seek new discovery. They are looking for new things and things that don't meet the old standard. The first step in science procedure is inductive approach. However, inductive approach is not always correct. The second step in science procedure is hypothesis testing. A hypothesis that has been repeatedly disproved is a robust hypothesis. A robust hypothesis can be translated into reliable hypothesis. However, hypothesis is a hypothesis. From the above, it can be said that divergence and correction and hypothesis are the characteristic of science. Next slide, please. How should contractor interact with emerging science? Contractors' motivation is to make economic benefit, and to do so, they need to make a plan based on clear and solid standard and evidence. On the other hand, those who management bodies such as ISA seek a public benefit because the area and its resources are the common heritage of mankind. To that end, they will create fair rule with clear and solid standard and evidence. Given those circumstances, scientific knowledge that is destined to diverge and revise may not be compatible with contractor and administrators who demand clear and solid standard. However, I don't say that contractor and administrators should downplay science. What I want to say is necessity of mutual understanding between scientists and contractors as different actors during ocean developing process. Next slide, please. I don't think we should be to depend on science in decision-making process. Just following what scientists and experts said is a waiver of responsibility of contractor and administrators. On the other hand, scientists should also consider decision-making process and stakeholder. In other words, scientists should know that they are also one of the stakeholder, and then scientific knowledge is one of the opinion for decision-making process. What's important is to know each other's characteristics. We will fulfill our contractor's obligation to ISA while incorporating emerging science with the help of external advisor. We look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tomo, very much as well. So behind the scenes, we realized, you know, each of the presentations in and of themselves was important to have kind of laid out. And unfortunately, they went over just a hair what we'd anticipated. So what we're going to do now is we're going to just jump right back on schedule, but we're going to skip the 3 questions that we put into the agenda. I've checked with the panelists and they're okay with that. And so I'm going to just, we've had a lot of comments and questions from the participants. So thanks to all of you for bringing those into the mix. So I'm going to just start with those and we'll do our best to touch on as many of the kind of areas that that we can get to. So the first one, and we're going to start with some science stuff. So the first one was that baseline information seems to be critical to monitoring and controlling pelagic impacts. What's the most important baseline information that should be collected for the pelagic realm, and who is ultimately responsible for collecting it? Any thoughts? And I'll just ask the presenters to all turn on their videos, and we'll just have all of us here kind of like a panel.
Hi, Paul, this is Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the critical things is, you know, and this is particularly because some of the regions in which mining is going to occur have been so poorly studied in terms of midwater ecosystems, that just having a really good midwater baseline of what the community is composed of and how that is vertically structured in the water column is probably one of the main priority items. So just an answer to that question that was asked.
Okay.
As far as who is ultimately responsible for this, perhaps Michelle can handle that component of the question.
All right.
If I could chip in on
thoughts on that?
Just to follow up on what Jeff said, I actually think, I feel like the biodiversity baseline is not necessarily the most important thing, which may be controversial since I'm a biologist, but I mean, we know that there's a lot of creatures out there, but it's so much work to get that information across this large region. And there's an implication there that there's going to be some threshold of biodiversity that says, okay, it's okay to, you know, to damage this ecosystem. If it's lower than that, if it's higher than that, then we need to preserve it. So I feel like the stuff that Jeff alluded to before about the effects, how it's going to affect the organisms is maybe even more important. And also there was a question about ocean currents. I mean, I think we need modeling by, like Paul Hill and Thomas Peacock and others are looking at the modeling of these plumes and also the currents. If we could get better information about that, it would help us immensely understand the potential spread and the potential effects.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Michelle, any thoughts from you on that question? In as particular, who's ultimately responsible for collecting it?
Sorry, Paul, who's ultimately responsible for collecting?
I mean, assuming that, I mean, you've got to make the assumption there that there's some baseline information should be collected for the pelagic realm. That's the questioner's thought. Who would be responsible for collecting it? And I guess that would go to kind of any data. Who's ultimately responsible for collecting it?
Well, some of it, the contractors are responsible for collecting it as a part of their contractual obligation. I'm not a scientist, so I don't want to get myself in trouble, but under the regulations, there is a basic description of the responsibility that certainly some baseline information has to be collected in terms of, for environmental monitoring purposes. So yeah, my quest, what I'm not sure of is that, does the information you're describing there fall into that category? Yeah. Mm-hmm. If it does, then yes, it is the contractor's responsibility to collect that information.
And tying to your talk, I mean, is that something that potentially gets incorporated into standards and guidelines as information that's required, or where would that get fit in?
The requirement is already currently under the exploration regulations. The requirement is in the regulations. What would be in the standards and guidelines is the general requirements as how it would be collected, for example.
Okay.
Procedures for, so because standards and guidelines are about specific procedures, requirements. In other words, it's the detail, it's the processes and procedures that are in the standards and guidelines. The regulations are the overarching framework, and it's the details that are put in the standards and guidelines.
Okay, thanks. The next question, and Steve, you kind of already not took the whole wind out of it, but there was a whole suite of questions about plumes themselves. You know, there's a whole bunch. I'll just kind of read them out, and I've put them in the chat box for you, the panelists. How much do we know about plumes, including from models? What assumptions are we making at this point about their dispersion, composition, and variability in different oceanic environments? And what gaps do we have in that knowledge? And while we're focused on the pelagic realm today, what assumptions are being made about their impacts on benthic communities? And there was also just a question about what, if any, kind of engagement with plume modelers did you have in the study, in addition to biologists? And I know Thomas Peacock, who you referenced, is on the call. I'm not sure we can do that technically. Technologically, I should say. So apologies, but if Tom has any comments, he could put them in the Q&A and we could try and read them. But otherwise, I'll turn to Jeff and Steve and Jesse on that.
Yeah, if I could start. So we are actually collaborating with Thomas Peacock. So he can also tell me in the chat whether I was wrong or not. But basically, I think working with modelers is very effective and very powerful tool because they will have the knowledge to tell us how far the plumes will spread. I will say that, you know, in order to model these things properly, we do need to have that baseline information of the oceanographic conditions at these different sites, which we currently don't have. And like some of these sites are huge, like the Clarendon-Clipperton zone is like 80% of the length to width of the United States. So, you know, these require a lot of environmental details that we don't necessarily have, which we already found through the work with Thomas Peacock as well. So that in collaboration with us biologists, we can try and like provide information that we want. So for example, we want modeling scenarios over the mining contractor's life, so 10 to 20 years. We might not necessarily care as much about the spatial details that modelers might need. So this is a very much of a trade-off, working together, telling each other what we need, rather than one person leading the charge. And we also as biologists can be really effective in saying, okay, well, we've been looking at other environmental studies in shallow waters and how these organisms respond to increased sediments. We see the levels that they really respond to, especially in how long that might, like how long even low sediment concentrations can have detrimental impacts. And that can help the modelers to kind of define the plumes, because right now we also don't really have the best way of saying, what is a plume? Like how much does it need to dilute? It could go back to background conditions, but maybe people would argue that that's not necessarily the best way of defining a plume. So it's very much an interchangeable way of discussing with the modelers and the biologists. What's the most effective way? What are the most effective modeling scenarios? What kind of data are we missing, and where can we make the assumptions?
Jeff or Steve, thanks Jesse, any other thoughts, Jeff or Steve, on that particular question?
Can I talk?
Yeah, of course, Tomo, go ahead.
So I will talk about contractor's position, not a scientific answer, but to make a model, contractor should provide mining wastewater information. For example, discharge depth, water quality, or quantity of discharge. On the other hand, in order to use the model, the scientists who predict the effect of discharge water should indicate the possibility. For example, infer, speculate, deduce, or conclude. Such like things important, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tomo. We don't have a lot of time, so I know there's a lot of people that would love to hear from Tom. We had contemplating trying to get him onto this webinar, but for a variety of reasons, it didn't work out. So apologies. I do think we may have some fodder, Andrew, for another webinar, maybe slightly differently structured, building off of this one. So there's a lot of questions we're not going to get to here today. But it's good to get an understanding of what the questions are, and we'll do some thinking, possibly with the panelists and possibly with others after this one concludes. I did want to ask maybe two more. One had to do with variability, and the question is, how do we assess and account for variability in the midwater column over time? And I think some of your presentations alluded to that, and including long-term effects like climate change. Is that possible to factor in? Jeff, it looked like you might want to say something there.
Yeah, well, clearly an answer to a question like this is in short time series, right? You want observations of the system across time so that you can understand and parameterize some of that variability. And that's a challenge to do. You've got companies that are hoping to construct baselines over a year or two, and then hopefully, be submitting an application for exploitation. So, hopefully you can encapsulate seasonal variability in a particular system, but interannual change is going to be much harder. We know from all of our climate change research that oftentimes you need decades of data to understand long time series changes and interannual changes. One approach, though, for climate change impacts that has proven pretty valuable is to use models which look at how, look at these CMIP5, these big model intercomparison products that use, look at changes in environmental drivers, and then such as food supply or temperature or other variables. And if you know how those environmental drivers relate to biology, then you can make some predictions about how climate change will affect these systems. So that is one way that you can at least make some predictions and incorporate climate change into these studies of the environment.
Thanks, Jeff. I just want to note, just because there was some, Steve had suggested that we hear from Tom Peacock. He did mention in the questions that is what he said on plumes. We have a good understanding of the dynamics of midwater plumes and now have models validated by field data in review. Aggregation will not be a significant factor, and the midwater plume may never actually settle, just dilute. Not necessarily a good thing to try and release a plume near the bottom. Key unknowns are thresholds and midwater turbulence levels for determining the extent of impact of the plumes. So clearly, as Tom said, and I think some of your presentations and your comments, Jeff and Steve and Jesse and Tomo, there is definitely some uncertainty about the plumes and some more work that's needed to understand those impacts at this point. Jeff, did you want to add more or respond in any way there?
No, just to say that, Tom's really doing some great work, and we really need this research because it determines the scale of effect. And that's just a key component of all of this.
Okay, last question that I'm going to be able to pull on here is the regulatory framework. How does the LTC reconcile its desire to ensure recommendations reflect the most current knowledge while also ensuring that they provide a stable regulatory regime that is not constantly changing? Secondly, are the contractors required to apply the updated guidelines for baseline assessments? How many are going to go back to study water columns or effects in water columns? How can the ISA ensure that contractors adapt best available science and emerging science? And I think that's a great question in terms of what we were hoping to kind of tee up with this webinar, but it probably goes to you, Michelle, first and foremost. Any thoughts on that?
Taking the last one first, yes, they are required to apply the updated recommendations, which is what I said. So starting next year, which is the first the first fair opportunity that they would have. So as of their annual reports next year, they will be assessed against the revised recommendations. So their reports will be assessed against the revised recommendations. So any data they produce at that point will be judged against them. And if there are gaps there, the gaps will be brought to their attention. This is hence the question of feedback being given to them about the adequacy of their sampling and other issues. So yes, and that's in the ongoing process of feedback, dialogue, and exchanges on an ongoing basis, as well as also in some cases regional workshops, different mechanisms of bringing those issues to their attention. The other question that is raised is if there is a tension there between, as you say, making sure that the regulations do reflect the most up-to-date science, but also regulatory certainty. And you can see the current updated regulations are an example of that, because the previous ones were done some time ago and it has taken a while to make the change, but that process evolved slowly. Well, I won't say slowly, it evolved over a period of time, and what was done in the interim was there were a series of workshops, consultations with the contractors, so they were aware of the science, the evolutions in science. They would have been aware of the fact that the ISA was thinking of the changes, recognize the evolving science. So it wouldn't have been new to the contractors as the stakeholders. At the same time, they would have been discussions with the scientific community, other stakeholders. So it's an evolutionary process. You bring all of the stakeholders to the table, you have the consultations, and then you make the changes to the regulations. It takes time, but it makes sure that all the persons who are affected are aware of the changes and they have fair notice of that. And it also brings to bear the transparency that, need I say, we are accused of not taking into account in our processes.
Okay, any other quick thoughts on that from anyone? If not, we've kind of hit. I'm not seeing anybody jumping into that one right at this moment. So apologies that we didn't have more time. The first webinar we set at 1:15. This one we set at an hour and a half. I think we're going to have to maybe push the next one to a little longer, but I think that Jeff and Steven and Jesse, your presentations and your paper and the work you did in the workshop and with all your colleagues obviously has struck a chord for many folks about some of the uncertainty in emerging science. But there's also a lot of kind of other perspectives in terms of, you know, how do you move forward given that uncertainty? Can you make decisions? Who makes those? How do they get informed, et cetera, that are undoubtedly being discussed and will require further discussions. As I said, this is fodder, some of these other questions that have been submitted for a potential future webinar, and we'll talk to the Pew folks and probably some of you all about that opportunity in the future. Just want to say a couple of closing remarks. One, we're going to be sharing a summary of this. We're also going to share a recording of the webinar as well as all the slides. We're also going to send a brief survey. So it'll come out in a couple of different tranches. One probably tomorrow with some of the survey and the presentations, a link to a website with all the presentations, and the recording, and then the summary a little bit later. I want to thank the Resolve team, Maya and Laura, for all the work they do and did behind the scenes, and obviously the Pew team, and then mostly obviously to all the presenters who put forward this time. So thanks to all 5 of you. Andrew, let me turn it over to you for some final remarks.
I know we're already over time, so thank you, Paul. Let me just say one more thank you to all of our panel participants, to all of you listening in for your participation and your excellent questions. Very sorry again that we couldn't get to all of them, even close to all of them, but we hope this will serve as a jumping off point for further discussion. And please do stay tuned for the topic and timing of our next session, and don't hesitate to reach out to me or Paul if you have thoughts about what we should be discussing next. Thanks again to everyone.
Okay. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are. Take care.